and welcome to Epiphytic Cacti. So today we're actually going to look at a species that is not really a Rhipsalis species at all anymore. It has a very, very strange history, but I figured this is a really, really good way of sort of understanding why some species names are just not valid or why they were reduced or some of the very strange taxonomic history. And so today we're looking at Rhipsalis platycarpa. Now, yesterday, a friend of mine sent me a message and was wondering about this. And so I did a little bit more digging, and I ended up finding an origin for this plant. And so I thought that this was super fascinating, and I figured I would do a video about it because I have actually seen Rhipsalis platycarpa distributed all over the world. I figured if we actually go through this, it will make a lot of sense as to why whatever Rhipsalis platycarpa you have probably is not Rhipsalis platycarpa at all. We're going to start at the most recent mentions of it, and we're going to work our way back all the way to the origin. The most recent mention of this was in Alice Calvente's Thesis, and I believe that this was in 2010 or 2011. So we can see that there's a description in here. However, the description that is actually in here is in the excluded names. And the reason why the species that are listed here are excluded was because they're taxonomically confused. Like there's no real correct application. It's just really kind of bizarre. So we know, because there's later information, like Rhipsalis rhombia has actually been, a neotype was selected. Rhipsalis rhombia is now a recognized species, so it just wasn't recognized here. But if we go down, we see Rhipsalis platycarpa, and we can see that it went under different names. And we can also see when this species was very first described was in 1837. That is very close to being 200 years ago. So the application of this name is extremely old, which is really interesting. So Britton and Rose in 1923 presented the illustration of Pfeiffer and Otto from 1838 as a reference to this name. The illustration is here selected as the neotype of Rhipsalis platycarpa. However, a careful analysis of the neotype and the original description of this taxon it looks like by both Zuccarini in 1836 and Pfeiffer in 1837 indicates that Rhipsalis platycarpa presents flowers with a sub-tetragonal ovary and fruit. These traits are not present in any other species of Rhipsalis, suggesting that this species likely represents another genus of Cactaceae or a specimen with anomalous flowers. So the next mention that I could find of this name was in an old EPIG issue. And so the issue was from the summer of 1996. It looks like maybe it was number 2. So this is actually pretty old. And this was actually published in an article by Ralph Bauer, and it was The Names of the Genera and Species of Epiphytic Cacti, Part 1. And really, all it really says about this is the following names are uncertain and should not be used because the initial description is inaccurate. That includes Rhipsalis cribata by Lemaire, Rhipsalis parasitica by Linnaeus and by Hawthorne, Rhipsalis platycarpa by Zuccarini and Pfeiffer, Rhipsalis rhombia by Salm, Dyke, and Pfeiffer, and Rhipsalis rugulosa by Lemaire. Now we see another mention of this, and this was an article that was in Acta, Botanica, Brasilica, and it was published in July of 1995. And the article name is The Genus Rhipsalis, Gartner, Cactaceae in Sao Paulo State, 2. Species with flattened joints. Okay, so first and foremost, a lot of times in these books, they'll have these key or in articles they'll have a key to species identification. And so one of the only things that it goes down to say about this Rhipsalis platycarpa is that the branches are 5 centimeters wide and 13 centimeters long, maybe is what it's supposed to be saying. And it also says that they're very thick. The particular part of this is actually concerning Rhipsalis pachyptera, and it is not actually concerning Rhipsalis platycarpa. A lot of publications you will find that Rhipsalis platycarpa was reduced as a synonym of Rhipsalis pachyptera. But this article has something kind of interesting and a little bit different to say about this, and I thought this was really kind of fascinating. And I do want to show the illustration because it's kind of important. The plant that is actually pictured here is Rhipsalis pachyptera. And I want to point something out about this that is just so often mixed up about this. All right, if we take a very close look at Rhipsalis pachyptera, you will notice that, which has been described, it was described by Alice Calvente too, there's kind of not really a whole lot of stamen in there, but you'll also notice how closely the flower sits into the areole. If we look really closely at old botanical sketches, see this? You can actually see that the ovary of this particular species is like really short, like really, really short. So that's something about that particular species. I believe that what's in the bottom here is actually Rhipsalis rhombia. And then what they have over on the right here is that they're saying is Rhipsalis platycarpa. And I'm not sure if this is actually the material of where this was supposed to come from. I don't really know. Because they're not really in English, I have a really hard time deciphering what is going on, like with the figure annotations and stuff. But one thing that I'm going to point out about this thing that they're saying is Rhipsalis platycarpa is, you see how different the flower seems? The ovary is very, very long on whatever this is. You can see in all the sketches, it's really long. The flower really doesn't look the same. And to me, that's indicative of like whatever they're looking at here, they're not the same species. It's something else. So if we go on to read what Lombardi has to say about this, in talking about specifically Rhipsalis pachyptera, he's saying that it's a very common species in the Atlantic forest, and it is distinguished from Rhipsalis rhombia and Rhipsalis platycarpa by the shape and size of the branches, the presence of thorns on the areoles, and the color of the fruit. The validity of this species, Rhipsalis crispata, by Pfeiffer and Rhipsalis crispamarginata by Lofgren in relation to Rhipsalis pachyptera, Rhipsalis rhombia, and Rhipsalis platycarpa remains to be verified, and they are probably simply environmental variants with the margin of the branches crisped. You have to remember that I have to pass these through Google Translate, so that translation could be totally off. Anyway, he goes on to say that Rhipsalis rhombia is distinguished from Rhipsalis platycarpa basically by having clearly smaller and thinner branches, a character that is maintained even when the two species are kept in cultivation under the same conditions in the greenhouse. And then he goes on to describe Rhipsalis platycarpa. It says the branches are elliptical to ovate. They are 12.5 centimeters long and 4.5 centimeters wide. They have a crenate margin with winged basal branches, areoles with triangular scales, reflexed corolla flowers, 0.9 centimeters long and 1.5 centimeters in diameter, with 1 to 2 flowers per areole. The tepals are 9, the outermost triangular greenish, the innermost elliptical, white. Stamens about 80, and it says tetralobed stigma. Fusiform pericarpal, naked with scales. Globoid fruit. about 0.5 centimeters in diameter, red to pinkish, fusiform with black seeds. And then he goes on to say that Rhipsalis platycarpa and Rhipsalis rhombia are basically distinguishable by the size of the branches, a characteristic that is maintained under cultivation of the species under the same conditions. Perhaps the two taxa should be considered a subspecies of Rhipsalis rhombia. Rhipsalis platycarpa was described as having green fruit with red edges, probably an immature fruit, a hypothesis already raised by Britton and Rose in 1923. Rhipsalis elliptica is probably a synonym of Rhipsalis platycarpa, being distinguished solely by the color of the fruit. And so, basically, Rhipsalis elliptica we know usually has pinkish fruit. And so whatever this particular plant that was described here seems to also have pinkish fruit. And based off of the illustrations here, whatever is illustrated as Rhipsalis platycarpa in this particular article, I would definitely say is Rhipsalis elliptica. So, as well as I think in the United States, when I see this Rhipsalis platycarpa, most of the time it's Rhipsalis elliptica. A very kind of interesting and beautiful clone, it appears. So the next mention that we have of this was an article that was published in Bradlea, issue 13, pages 43 to 79. Now, the authors of this are Wilhelm Barthlott and Nigel P. Taylor. Nigel P. Taylor, FYI, happens to be one of my absolute favorite authors. I love almost reading anything that they have to write about Rhipsalis. And Wilhelm Barthlott is probably like the leading expert for Rhipsalis. The name of this article is Notes Towards a Monograph of Rhipsalidae Cactaceae. And so this is the next mention that we have of this again, 1995. And what they have to say about this. Rhipsalis platycarpa, originally described by Zuccarini and then by Pfeiffer. Epiphyllum platycarpum by Zuccarini, and it says in a publication in 1836. I don't quite know because the publication is abbreviated. It says cact Munich. I'm not sure what that means. But that was actually quoted from Britton and Rose in 1923. And it says, not seen by us and not cited by Zuccarini himself when publishing Sirius platycarpus. Zuccarini have absolutely no idea what any of that. It's a bunch of abbreviations, I believe, of another publication. And the most that I'm going to make out about this was Munchin, volume 2, page 736 in 1837, which clearly postdates Rhipsalis platycarpa, described by Pfeiffer in, it says, enum cact. Again, it's a publication. They're always abbreviated. It's extremely obnoxious because it's very hard to find those publications when they're abbreviated like that. But anyway, on page 131 in 1837. So that is where Pfeiffer originally described his. So from the sounds of what's going on here is I think that some of the publications actually attribute the original description or the original species to Zuccarini. But then it looks like, because there's something kind of funny about what Zuccarini did, that Pfeiffer would actually be given the true original description. Anyway, and then it says that Pfeiffer's later illustration of a plant under this name, and again, it gives another publication. It looks like maybe on page 17 in 1840, maybe, depicts a plant with peculiar flowers and cannot be satisfactorily identified with any extent Rhipsalis known to the present authors. A herbarium specimen, Herbarium Kummer at Munich, I'm not sure what that means. I think it's just some kind of citation for the herbarium sheet. Has been determined as Rhipsalis platycarpa by Myron Kimnoch, but was originally and correctly identified as Rhipsalis Pachyptera, which was also originally described by Pfeiffer by an unknown hand in 1838. So it seems like whatever was going on with some specimen that was attributed as Rhipsalis platycarpa by Myron Kimnoch was actually later identified as Rhipsalis pachyptera. And so the reason why this is important is because you will find that Rhipsalis platycarpa is quite commonly listed as a synonym of Rhipsalis pachyptera. But what's important about this is that it has to be the exact specimen from whatever was in the herbarium sheet that was at Munich. So that's the kind of a weird thing, because I think that too, a lot of times, we're finding like distribution of Rhipsalis platycarpa that looks super legit because it has collection identification with it. And whether that is actually the specimen that belongs with this exact herbarium sheet, which was identified as Rhipsalis pachyptera. But then you also have to consider what Lombardi is saying, that if whatever was in the sketch that Lombardi had was actually the same plant from that herbarium sheet, it seems like that plant is probably Rhipsalis elliptica and not even Rhipsalis pachyptera. So a lot of that seems very confused. And especially here, because they're saying that it was like an unknown, nobody really knows who decided that whatever was in that herbarium sheet was actually Rhipsalis pachyptera. This is a possible identification for this poorly typified name, which should not be allowed to displace Rhipsalis pachyptera by Pfeiffer, if indeed it was published earlier. Even in this particular publication in 1995, when it says Rhipsalis platycarpa, they did not decide at this time that this was a synonym of Rhipsalis pachyptera at all. They actually decided that it was a name of uncertain application. All right, so now if we go to the Cactaceae, Descriptions and Illustration of Plants of the Cactus Family, by N.L. Britton and J.M. Rose, Volume 4, published in December of 1923, we can see that there is a mention of Rhipsalis platycarpa. There's actually a few mentions in here. But what's very interesting is that the first thing that we are actually looking at is what at this time was Acanthorhipsalis crenata. Now, Acanthorhipsalis crenata is actually now recognized as Lymanbensonia crenata. And what's interesting here is that they're saying that when this was first described, this species was thought to be nearest to the Brazilian Rhipsalis platycarpa, which it resembles, but that species has no spines. So that was it's a very interesting note. So they're trying to say here is that whatever Rhipsalis platycarpa is, it actually looks like Acanthorhipsalis crenata, which is pretty interesting. And then again, if we actually look at the key to identification, it basically just kind of says here, flowers and fruit usually solitary at the areoles. That's kind of the best thing that's going to give us there. But here we see this really strange thing. So Rhipsalis platycarpa. It says the branches are broad and flat, 1 to 2 decameters long. So that's 10 to 20 centimeters long. And 3 centimeters broad or more, with dull green becoming red when grown in sunlight, with broad, deep crenation. Flowers are borne towards the apex of the branch, 1 to 3 per areole, 1.6 to 1.8 centimeters long, greenish yellow or dull white. Petals are 8 millimeters long. Ovate. Stamens are white. Stigma lobes 5, white. The fruit, doubtless immature, was naked, green, somewhat compressed, angled, and truncate. And basically this says that it was from Brazil. It was Organ Mountains in Brazil. They say that they have obtained plants of the species from Mr. Lamb at Manchester in 1904, and Dr. Rose found it wild in the Organ Mountains in Brazil in 1915. There, it looks like that thing where it has the number 21159 would actually be a field collection number, looks like. It grows well in cultivation, but it has never flowered for them. Well, it says that there's illustrations by Pfeiffer and Otto in a publication, but then figure 230 that is shown in this publication, it actually says that it's the branch of the plant obtained by Dr. Rose in the Organ Mountains. And I'm going to suggest that whatever is illustrated here probably is not Rhipsalis platycarpa. Probably not. So this publication can get a little bit confusing, but the publication is the Archives of Jardim Botanico. I don't know if I'm saying that right. And it is from Rio de Janeiro. And this was published in 1915. The volumes that happen to be here, though, are volumes 1 and 2. And again, this publication is not in English. And so again, we have kind of a key to the species identification. And the only thing that it says about this is that the flowers, it says it has greenish yellow flowers that are closed and that it has a truncated berry. And so those are the keys to the identification, which is really interesting. Because at this time, we make like this really strange, gigantic jump from this like kind of these weird sketches of what appear to be Rhipsalis elliptica, but are attributed as Rhipsalis pachyptera, to a completely and wildly different description, which is the description that Alice Calvente was kind of hitting on. Like, the original description for this is so bizarre. All right, so here they actually say that Rhipsalis platycarpa was originally described by Pfeiffer. So they don't say that this was described originally by Zuccarini. It was described by Zuccarini in 1836. So again, that is kind of the same thing that Barthlott and Taylor were saying, that there's like, you know, some questions there about who described what when originally. And it makes sense. It's very difficult because of being 200 years ago. And so the description here just goes on to say, the bush is erect, almost phylocactus in habit. And phylocactus at this time, I believe, is actually what we today know as epiphyllum. And I don't mean like the thing that's actually probably a whole bunch of Dicocactus hybrids mainly. I mean actual epiphyllum, the genus, the actual species with all the white flowers that typically flower, around dusk. So like phylocactus, species. But the serrated joints are less long and unequal, and the apex is obtuse. I'm not exactly sure about the translation here again, because it says articles up to 30 cents. I think that what is trying to say is that the branches are up to 30 centimeters or something. Yeah, I think it's trying to say the branches are up to 30 centimeters long and 1 to 5 centimeters wide, often reddish towards the edges, lateral and spurious terminal flowers, perigoniums scarcely open, Pachyptera berry. So again, we're getting kind of this sudden like weird shift here where we're talking about a flower that doesn't really open, and then we're talking about a berry that is angled. And so again, going back to Alice Calvente, like her paper, her thesis, questioning like this angled berry thing and whether or not whatever was described here was ever in fact a Rhipsalis to begin with. And so it says the plant is tall up to 1 meter and very branched. The joints are foliaceous, up to more than 30 centimeters long and 4 to 5 centimeters wide, with a wide prominent central rib. Crenate tooth margined with distant long lying teeth, dark green and often reddish. The bows in the sleep of the crenes with little wool and without bristles. I think it just means basically like at the areoles, there's not very much wool, and it says that there aren't any bristles there. And then it says the flowers are lateral, solitary, large, with 10 green paragonal leaves, dead yellow, elliptic, obtuse as if erect, leaving little of the flower open. The stamens are shorter than the paragonium, with hyaline elbow filaments, and is only known that it comes from Brazil, but not the location. In the state of, I don't know how to say that, Bahia, we saw a specimen that at first glance looked like a phylocactus, but upon examination, it looked like this species is likely what it was. So it sounds like they saw something and it was unusual and weird, and it seems like that was actually the right kind of species. So now if we actually go to this like thing that I stumbled upon today. So this is this old publication, and what's cool about this is that one of the authors of this publication is Dr. Louis Pfeiffer. So the exact person who is attributed quite often to having initially described this particular species. So I think that when we look at this, whatever Rhipsalis platycarpa was, this publication is probably going to be the authority for whatever Rhipsalis platycarpa was. And so this publication was published in 1843, and I don't quite know how to say this. I think that this is in 2 different languages. So I believe that this is published both in German and in French simultaneously, which is kind of strange. And basically, I think it's like figures of Cactaceae. And so we get a description here, but again, this description is not actually in English. They have 2 different descriptions here. One of these is in German again, and one of them is in French. For whatever mysterious reason, we also have Rhipsalis alata here. I'm not exactly sure why, but it says Rhipsalis alata suberecta branches with green teeth, with round teeth, sometimes with a red edge in the middle of the nerves, the hair removed, the younger men bearded. So I think it's just trying to say that when the areoles are younger, they probably have hairs in them. And then it says, does it live in Brazil? Basically, I think it's saying, does it come from Brazil? And I think that what's being talked about here specifically is what we know today as Pseudo-Rhipsalis alata. So I'm not exactly sure why there's a mention of this just kind of randomly in here, but the description for Rhipsalis platycarpa, it says this plant, which probably comes from Brazil, was also first reported to the Munich Botanical Garden in Petersburg. As long as it doesn't bloom, it appears to be cerium. And so again, I think that they're just trying to say that it appears to be serious. And at this time, I think that, again, it would have been that it appeared to look like an epiphyllum species. Again, it says very similar to Philanthus, with footed, long, winged, green branches notched at the edges, often red at the edges. In Munich in September, it showed its unsightly, dirty white flowers. Like, That's such a terrible description of these flowers. Near the tips of the branches, which are characterized by a very peculiar structure of the ovary. This is, in fact, dented from the sides in such a way that it shows 4 protruding broad edges, which are dull and reddish. The corolla hardly opens. The petals are egg-shaped, stamens white. The style is slightly longer with 5 white spread stigmas. The fruit is naked, greenish, and in the shape of the ovary. So again, we're talking about this weird angled ovary, and then we're talking about even when this kind of weird angled ovary, when the fruit is ripe, is still carrying this kind of weird angled shape. There is an enlarged image of the internal parts in figure 6. So this was my favorite part of this, is that sometimes if we dig around enough, we can actually find the original illustrations of some of these plants. And so what's really cool is that this crazy thing right here with these like crazy weird, you can see these absolutely bizarre ovaries and these absolutely bizarre flowers. So again, they're saying that they're dirty white, they barely open. There is, essentially a figure you can see down here, Rhipsalis platycarpa. You can see the figure of the branch. It definitely resembles an epiphyllum. I genuinely think it also resembles what we know today as Lymanbensonia, which might be why in Britton and Rose there was kind of a strange notation that was in there that said that it seemed like what we know today as Lymanbensonia crenata actually really strongly resembled whatever this is. I think that there is a species that might actually be kind of similar to this, being Lymanbensonia brevispina, perhaps, which is a Lymanbensonia that has white flowers. I don't know that those ovaries quite look like that, but I do know that the ovaries on Lymanbensonia are in fact angular. I don't know if they're quite like that, but this is a very interesting sketch. There we go. We turn it on its side so we can get like a full better view of this. So what we can say about this is that here, Dr. Louis Pfeiffer himself would have actually been part of this whole entire publication. So whatever, again, is depicted in here would factually be whatever Rhipsalis platycarpa was. And Rhipsalis platycarpa very obviously is not an actual Rhipsalis. What it is, I don't really know. I don't know if it's a Lymanbensonia. I don't exactly know what was illustrated here. But we can for sure say that whatever's floating around in the world being sold under these names of Rhipsalis platycarpa can't be Rhipsalis platycarpa. Perhaps it's definitely not this species. So this is where a lot of this becomes very dubious. So if you have like all of these sellers that are in fact selling Rhipsalis platycarpa, and it is not actually this species, it's possible that it is totally random and made up. From the herbarium sheet, that was either Rhipsalis Pachyptera or Rhipsalis elliptica. It's possible that it's those. So I figured for fun, we would also go to GBIF.org and look up Rhipsalis platycarpa and see what kind of herbarium sheets we can find. There we go. So we actually see that we have all these different herbarium sheets at all these different botanical gardens. And we can see that none of these really seem to look at all like what Dr. Pfeiffer described or had a sketch of. So this is kind of a weird thing because, again, like just because it comes from a botanical garden and just because it has a collection ID, whether that's a botanical garden identifier or whether that's an accession number, a field identifier, what have you, doesn't necessarily mean that it's correct. Like here we can see this plant, and you can see that someone came along that looks like in 1995 and decided that this was Rhipsalis platycarpa. But it also looks like it was corrected at some point, and the name was actually changed to Rhipsalis elliptica. And you can also see there's like the coordinates. I think that they use those coordinates for the accession numbers quite often. So kind of interesting there. I'll wager that most of the other ones that we see here are also Rhipsalis elliptica. Again, we see that someone came along in 95 and said, hey, that's platycarpa, but again, we see that it's listed as Rhipsalis elliptica. We can see that these are from a botanical garden this is the Jardim Botanico. So I think it's to the botanical garden, a botanical garden in Rio de Janeiro, actually. Here we see some more. The coordinates were missing for this one. And again, we see the same person in 95 came along and said that this is Rhipsalis platycarpa. So it seems like someone was continuously trying to say Rhipsalis elliptica was Rhipsalis platycarpa. And then here we see one this one was really interesting because this one is a herbarium sheet from, where is this? I don't know what that says. What's interesting is that this one it was originally deemed as Rhipsalis platycarpa. Oddly enough, that person's name is the same person who was saying all of the Rhipsalis elliptica was Rhipsalis platycarpa. And here we can see that this was later identified as Rhipsalis cuneata. And again, here, I believe that this one is from, I guess, and we see up in the corner that this is the University of Texas herbarium. So this is a herbarium sheet from Texas, and this one was deemed as Rhipsalis platycarpa. Again, we have the same name, that exact same name that's on the other ones, saying that those plants are Rhipsalis platycarpa. Wager again, that's probably not. And here again, we see another one. And this is the New York Botanical Garden. So in the New York Botanical Garden, we have this plant that says it's Rhipsalis platycarpa. Can't really read or make out what the rest of it says. But obviously, that is also doesn't look anything like the Rhipsalis platycarpa that Pfeiffer illustrated. And then we see some kind of interesting stuff. So we see whatever this is. So that's kind of interesting. It says Rhipsalis platycarpa. This is the Harvard University. And this herbarium, that actually looks more like a Pseudo-Rhipsalis. So it looks like something like Pseudo-Rhipsalis amazonica. So that's kind of interesting. And then we look at the last herbarium sheet here, and this one is Pseudo-Rhipsalis amazonica, but was initially attributed as being Rhipsalis platycarpa. It's possible, you might be like, how could anyone get that confused? Doesn't that species have like pinkish blue flowers? I actually believe that there are some that have albinism in their flowers, so that the flowers are white instead of being like pinky and bluey. So that might be how that confusion kind of happened there. But there you have it. So none of these herbarium sheets that are in any of these botanical gardens or universities look anything like really whatever Dr. Pfeiffer described. If we just take a quick look and we look at something like Lymanbensonia, images real fast here, you can see here some images of Lymanbensonia brevispina, which does look kind of similar, and I would think that you would confuse that. Here's a herbarium sheet. I would think that there was the potential to confuse that pretty seriously with a Rhipsalis. I mean, I guess, like, you know, here you can see in that picture, I think that's actually on EPIG. They have some great photo galleries. You can see the EPIG picture. You can see that Lymanbensonia brevispina does have white flowers, but it seems like it's missing like the super angular sort of ovaries. But in some of the other ones, you do see these super angular sort of ovaries. They are really angular and kind of crazy. So see how angular that is? So yeah, I'm not really sure. And you know what? Maybe it was even crazier than that. Maybe it was actually like Lymanbensonia incachicana, but a form with albinism. And so the flowers were dirty white instead of being, you know, instead of being like they are shown here with this kind of pinky color, because these flowers, they also barely open. So I don't know. You know, all those things I think are possibilities. I'm not terribly sure that we'd ever really know unless the plant is still alive out there somewhere. If there's still specimens out there and we could like get our hands on them, or someone could like really study them and figure out like what the heck was this to begin with. But I definitely thought that was a really interesting topic. Thank you for watching, and as always, happy cacti growing.